The hospital lobby was designed to impress. Everything about it felt intentional: the polished marble floors, the glass walls that reflected soft morning light, the quiet hum of efficiency that moved through the space like a controlled breath. People walked with purpose here. Some wore white coats. Others carried clipboards or tablets. Even the waiting patients seemed to sit a little straighter, as if the building itself demanded seriousness. This was a place associated with intelligence, authority, and education. For Dr. Maya Ellison, walking through that lobby felt familiar, but never comfortable. She moved calmly through the crowd. Her steps measured, her shoulders relaxed in a way that came from long practice. Maya was in her early 30s, with dark skin that caught the light softly, and a face that rarely gave away everything she felt. Her hair was pulled back neatly, practical rather than stylish, the way it always was on long workdays. She wore plain scrubs under a simple jacket, nothing that stood out, nothing that announced importance. Her medical school badge hung from a lanyard beneath her jacket, partially hidden. Not intentionally concealed, just unnoticed, the way things often were when people weren't looking for them. Maya wasn't late. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't lost. But the space around her reacted as if she didn't fully belong. As she approached the information desk, a receptionist glanced up briefly, then looked past her, assuming she was there to wait, not to ask. A man in a tailored suit stepped ahead of her without hesitation. No apology followed. Maya didn't say anything. She simply adjusted her position and waited again. This wasn't new. She had learned early that some assumptions arrived before introductions. That in spaces like this, people decided who you were before you ever spoke. Maya didn't fight every moment. You couldn't. Doing so would leave you exhausted before the day even began. She checked her phone. One unread message from a resident about morning rounds, then slid it back into her pocket. Her expression didn't change, but inside she felt the familiar tightening. Not anger. Not yet. Just awareness. Nearby, a small group of medical students laughed quietly, comparing schedules. One of them glanced at Maya, then away again, eyes already moving on. The look was quick but telling. She had seen it thousands of times. The look that measured, categorized, dismissed. Uneducated. Unimportant. Temporary. Maya continued walking toward the elevators. A security guard stood near the doors, scanning badges as staff entered. When Maya stepped forward, he hesitated just a moment longer than necessary. His eyes dropped to her clothes, then back to her face. "Where are you headed?" he asked, tone neutral but firm. She answered calmly, naming the floor. The guard nodded slowly, as if processing whether the response made sense. Only then did his eyes catch the edge of her badge peeking out from beneath her jacket. His posture shifted slightly. Not enough to apologize, but enough to signal reconsideration. He waved her through. Maya didn't react. Inside the elevator, she stood alone, watching the doors close. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored walls. To anyone else, she probably looked unbothered, professional, steady. But inside, a familiar thought surfaced, one she never invited, yet never fully escaped. Why is my presence always questioned before my ability? She exhaled slowly as the elevator climbed. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Another responsibility. Another reminder that despite how she was perceived, she carried lives in her hands every day. Still, perception mattered. Because perception shaped how people listened. As she stepped out onto her floor, voices floated down the hallway. Nurses moved quickly between rooms. A senior doctor stood near the station, reviewing charts. Maya approached, ready to give an update, when the doctor spoke without looking up. "Can you grab those files for me?" he said, gesturing vaguely. Maya paused, The request wasn't offensive on its own. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruel. But it landed heavy because it fit too neatly into a pattern. The assumption that she was there to assist, not decide. To carry, not lead. She met his eyes calmly. "I'm on that case," she said evenly. The doctor blinked, surprised not by her words, but by who they came from. His gaze dropped, finally noticing her badge. "Oh," he said, clearing his throat. "Right." Just one word, but it said everything. Maya nodded once and moved past him toward the patient rooms. She didn't correct him, didn't explain, didn't defend herself. She had done all of that before. Too many times. What lingered wasn't the interaction itself, it was how easily it had happened, how confidently, and how normal it felt to everyone else around them. By the time she reached the end of the hallway, Maya knew something clearly, even if she didn't say it out loud. Today wouldn't just test her skills as a doctor. Would test whether the people around her were willing to see her as one. The first real blow didn't come with raised voices or open hostility. It arrived quietly, wrapped in professionalism, delivered in a tone that sounded reasonable to everyone except the person receiving it. Mid-morning rounds moved quickly. The team gathered outside the patient rooms, white coats brushing past one another, notes exchanged in short, efficient bursts. Maya stood among them, tablet in hand, prepared. She had reviewed the charts twice. She knew the lab results. She had spent extra time with the patient the night before, explaining options carefully, answering questions no one else had slowed down enough to hear. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped forward naturally, but before she could finish her first sentence, the attending physician cut in. "We'll have someone else handle the explanation," he said, already turning slightly toward another resident. "Let's keep things moving." The words weren't harsh. They weren't shouted. But they shut something down. Maya stopped mid-thought. For a brief moment, the hallway felt louder than before. The shuffle of shoes, the beeping from a nearby monitor, the quiet murmurs behind her, all of it pressed in. She nodded once and stepped back, swallowing the confusion that rose too fast to fully understand. One questioned the decision. No. One asked why. The explanation was simply reassigned, passed to someone with less experience on the case, someone who hadn't spent the extra hours, someone who looked more like what authority was expected to look like. Maya stood there, listening as the explanation was delivered poorly. Important details were rushed. Questions were brushed aside. The patient nodded politely, even though confusion lingered clearly in their eyes. Maya said nothing. She had learned when speaking up would help, and when it would only brand her as difficult. This moment, she sensed, fell into the second category. So she remained still, professional, silent. But inside, something cracked. After rounds ended, Maya retreated briefly to the break room. She didn't sit. She didn't reach for coffee. She leaned against the counter, hands resting flat, grounding herself. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and reheated food. A small television played quietly in the corner. Ignored by everyone. She replayed the moment in her head, not obsessively, but carefully. She examined it the way she examined symptoms, looking for logic, looking for justification. Was it her tone? Her timing? Her wording? The answer came back the same every time. No. This wasn't about performance. It was about perception. She remembered other moments like this, scattered across years of training. Being mistaken for support staff. Being spoken over during discussions. Being asked where she went to school in a way that wasn't curiosity, but doubt. Each moment on its own had been easy to explain away. Together, they formed something harder to ignore. Systemic. That word floated through her mind, heavy and uncomfortable. Later that day, Maya found herself at the nurse's station reviewing notes when a patient's family member approached her. The woman looked tired, anxious, eyes darting between staff members. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "Can you tell me when the doctor will be coming back?" Maya met her gaze calmly. "I'm the doctor," she said gently. The woman froze. "Oh," she replied, eyes widening slightly. I thought—" Her voice trailed off, embarrassment creeping in. Maya smiled politely, reassuringly, the way she always did. She answered the questions thoroughly, patiently. The woman thanked her, relief evident now. But the moment lingered long after she walked, away, not because of the mistake, but because of how instinctive it had been. That evening, as Maya prepared to leave, she overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to. Two staff members stood near the lockers, speaking casually, unaware she was within earshot. "She's smart," one of them said, "but she doesn't really seem polished." "Yeah," the other replied. "Not what you expect." Maya paused, unseen, listening. "Not what you expect." The phrase echoed louder than it should have. She walked past them without comment, collecting her bag, maintaining her composure. But the words followed her all the way to the parking garage, settling into her chest like a bruise you don't notice until you touch it. By the time she reached her car, the confusion had sharpened into clarity. This wasn't about a single moment. This was about a system that questioned her before listening, doubted her before observing, underestimated her before knowing her. Named the injustice wasn't dramatic, it was subtle. And that was what made it dangerous, because subtlety allowed it to survive unchecked. Maya sat in her car for a moment before starting the engine. The day replayed itself in fragments, interrupted explanations, redirected authority, quiet assumptions layered beneath polite professionalism. She felt tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix, not because the work was hard, but because she was constantly required to prove something others were allowed to assume. As she pulled out of the garage, one thought remained steady, undeniable. This was the first blow, and if she stayed silent forever, it wouldn't be the last. The days that followed did not bring confrontation. They brought quiet. Maya moved through the hospital, as she always had, focused, disciplined, attentive, but something inside her had shifted. She still arrived early, still stayed late, still triple-checked charts and reviewed cases long after others had gone home. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Internally, every interaction now carried weight. She began to hesitate before speaking, not because she lacked confidence in her knowledge, but because she questioned how it would be received. She measured her tone carefully, softened her delivery, removed emotion from explanations that once came naturally. Where she had once spoken with clarity and conviction, she now spoke with caution. That caution cost her not in competence, but in connection. Medicine had always been more than memorization for Maya. It was communication, understanding, trust. She believed healing began when people felt seen. But now she found herself holding back parts of herself, worried that warmth might be misread as unprofessional, that passion might be labeled as insecurity. The contradiction wore on her. At night, exhaustion followed her home, settling deep in her bones. She lay awake replaying conversations, analyzing expressions, wondering if she had said too much or not enough. Her mind searched for patterns, trying to anticipate the unspoken expectations placed on her. She remembered her first day of medical school. How proud her family had been, how her mother had cried quietly while hugging her, whispering that every sacrifice had been worth it, how her father had told her she carried generations with her, that her success wasn't just personal, it was historical. Those memories should have been grounding. Instead, they added pressure, because now Doubt crept in where certainty once lived. Maya began questioning herself in ways she never had before. Not her intelligence, but her belonging. She wondered whether the institution had room for someone like her, or whether she would always exist on the margins, tolerated but never fully trusted. Isolation grew slowly. It wasn't that people excluded her outright. She was invited to meetings, included in rotations, praised for her work on paper. But the distance showed up in subtler ways. Conversations ended when she approached. Decisions were made without her input. Opportunities were offered to others first, even when her qualifications matched or exceeded theirs. She noticed it most during collaborative moments, group discussions where her suggestions were acknowledged politely, then rephrased by someone else and received with enthusiasm. Meetings where her presence felt conditional, as if she needed to constantly reaffirm her right to be there. She stopped volunteering opinions. Unless asked directly, silence became a shield. At home, her isolation followed her. When her mother called to check in, Maya kept her answers brief. She didn't want to worry her, didn't want to admit that the place she had worked so hard to reach felt increasingly unfamiliar. Her family believed she was thriving, and in many ways she was. But thriving and belonging were not the same thing. Late one evening, Maya stood alone in the hospital stairwell, phone pressed to her ear, listening as a classmate excitedly talked about a research opportunity they'd just been offered. Maya congratulated them sincerely. She meant it. But when the call ended, the silence returned heavier than before. She had applied for the same opportunity. She hadn't even been interviewed. The realization stung, not because she felt entitled, but because she felt overlooked. Again, she leaned against the cool concrete wall and closed her eyes. For a moment, she considered what it would feel like to speak up, to ask why, to challenge the pattern she was beginning to see clearly. But fear intervened. Fear of being labeled sensitive. Fear of being seen as confrontational. Fear of confirming stereotypes she had spent her life disproving. Fear of being told she was imagining things. So she stayed quiet. That choice protected her in the short term, but it chipped away at her over time. Maya began pulling inward. She kept conversations professional. She avoided unnecessary interactions. She focused on survival instead of growth. The work still mattered deeply to her, but the environment felt increasingly transactional, less about healing, more about endurance. And still, she excelled. Her evaluations remained strong. Her supervisors praised her diligence. Patients spoke highly of her care. On paper, she was succeeding, but success without recognition felt hollow. One afternoon, as she walked past a bulletin board filled with staff photos and achievements, she paused. Faces stared back, confident, celebrated, assured. She searched unconsciously for someone who looked like her. There were very few. The realization settled quietly, but firmly. She wasn't alone in her struggle, but she was isolated within it. That night, Maya sat at her kitchen table, textbooks open but untouched. Instead of studying, she stared at her reflection in the darkened window. She looked tired, older than she should have. Not from age, but from carrying questions that never seemed to have answers. She whispered a question into the silence. How much of myself do I have to leave behind to stay? The answer didn't come, but the question stayed. She clarified, not repeating herself, but strengthening her position. She cited additional evidence. She explained the risk of ignoring the details she had identified. She didn't frame it as a challenge to authority, but she didn't retreat from the truth. Either. Her stance was unmistakable. This wasn't about ego. This was about responsibility. The tension thickened, moments stretched. Someone cleared their throat. Another attending glanced between Maya and the chart again. The certainty in the room began to fracture, not loudly, But visibly, the system didn't know what to do with her in that moment. She wasn't defiant. She wasn't deferential. She was undeniable. Finally, the attending paused longer than before. The plan was reconsidered. Tests were reordered. Adjustments were made, not framed as correction, but as refinement, as collaboration. The language shifted subtly, but the meaning was clear. Maya had been right. The room exhaled. The group moved on, but the energy didn't reset. Something fundamental had shifted. Maya felt it not as triumph, but as alignment. Her voice hadn't disrupted the space. It had improved it. Later that day, the case confirmed what she had warned about. Early intervention prevented escalation. The outcome changed. Quietly, effectively. Word traveled. Not gossip. Recognition. Colleagues spoke differently around her. Some with respect that had been missing before. Others with curiosity. A few with discomfort, forced to confront how easily they had overlooked her before. Confrontation hadn't been loud, but it had been complete. For Maya, the impact settled slowly. She replayed the moment, not with anxiety, but with clarity. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't demanded validation. She had simply stood where she belonged and refused to move aside. That refusal echoed louder than any argument. The stand wasn't about proving she was capable. She already knew. It was about refusing to let competence be filtered through bias. It was about choosing integrity over comfort. That evening, as she walked out of the hospital, the city lights felt different. Not brighter, just steadier. She moved through the world without scanning herself for flaws. Without rehearsing restraint, she felt anchored. The system hadn't apologized. The institution hadn't changed overnight. But something irreversible had happened. She had been seen. Not as an exception, not as a surprise, but as a professional whose presence mattered. And once that truth surfaced, it couldn't be buried again, because the stand wasn't a single moment. It was a declaration, one she would carry forward into every room that tried to shrink her again. The shift did not announce itself. There were no emails sent out, no meetings called to acknowledge what had happened. No one gathered the staff to reflect on bias or fairness or the weight of assumptions. Institutions rarely move that way. Change, when it comes, often arrives quietly, slipping into behavior before it ever reaches policy. Maya noticed it in the smallest places first. In how her presence was no longer questioned before being accepted. In how attendings paused when she spoke, not out of politeness, but consideration. In how her notes were read fully instead of skimmed. These weren't grand gestures. They were subtle adjustments. But together, they formed something solid. Respect, not earned through spectacle. Not granted as an exception, but recognized as overdue. During rounds, she was asked for input without hesitation. Her name appeared more frequently in discussions about cases that required precision and judgment. When disagreements arose, they were framed as professional differences, not as corrections of her tone or demeanor. No one told her she had changed things, but the environment told her. The people who once underestimated her now watched her carefully, recalibrating assumptions they hadn't realized they carried. Some did it with humility, others with quiet resistance. Not everyone welcomed the shift, but no one could deny it. Maya didn't seek acknowledgement. She didn't want apologies that came only after exposure. She wanted permanence. And permanence came through consistency. She continued showing up prepared, continued speaking clearly, continued refusing to shrink herself to soothe discomfort. She didn't harden. She didn't become defensive. She remained grounded, knowing that dignity didn't require armor. It required alignment. outside the hospital. The changes followed her home. Her parents noticed it immediately. The way she spoke about her days had changed, not louder, not prouder, but steadier. There was less tension in her shoulders, less self-editing in her sentences. She no longer rehearsed conversations before sharing them. She simply spoke. They didn't celebrate with declarations. They understood what this moment meant. They had raised her to recognize injustice without letting it define her, to hold ambition without apology, to know that excellence didn't need permission to exist. Seeing her step fully into that truth felt like closure. Badge on her coat remained the same, but what it represented had shifted. It no longer felt like something she had to prove worthy of wearing. It felt like what it had always been, a reflection of work done, knowledge earned, and commitment honored. One afternoon, a younger student approached her quietly in the hallway, nervous, hesitant, unsure whether they were allowed to take up her time. They asked questions about med school, about belonging, about how to survive spaces that didn't seem built with them in mind. Maya listened. She didn't offer slogans. She didn't simplify the truth. She told them what mattered. That doubt would come, that bias would hide behind politeness, that being underestimated could wound deeply. But she also told them this: you don't need to become smaller to succeed. You don't need to perform humility to be respected. And you don't need permission to take your place. Those words didn't echo through a room, but they landed where they were meant to. The institution didn't transform overnight. Bias didn't disappear, but the space around Maya changed, and through it, the space around others began to shift too. When one assumption is exposed, it weakens the others connected to it. When one voice refuses to be dismissed, it makes room for more. That was the real outcome, not a moment of public recognition, but a recalibration of power. The people who once labeled her uneducated had to reconcile that label with reality, not through confrontation, but through competence that left no room for denial. The discomfort they felt wasn't her responsibility. She had already done her part. By the time Maya reached the end of her rotation, her reputation preceded her, not as a problem, not as a surprise, but as someone dependable, someone sharp, someone trusted. She walked the halls with certainty, not arrogance, not defiance, just presence. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that stays. And when she looked at her reflection in the glass, late one evening, Badge catching the light, eyes tired but focused, she didn't see a woman who had proven them wrong. She saw a woman who had refused to accept a lie. They had called her uneducated, but the truth had been there all along, quiet, prepared, relentless. Waiting for the moment, she decided not to carry their ignorance any longer. And when she let it go, she didn't just reclaim her dignity. She set a standard that could not be undone.